Welcome to Mansplaining, a podcast about the interesting things you can discover if you just take the time to learn. My name is Joe. I'm your host for this week. And as always, I'm joined by my college friend Mark. Together, we'll explore what's on our minds and hopefully figure out a thing or two about a thing or two. Mark, we are in the midst of a terrible, awful heat wave here in New York City, and I'm reflecting on how it affects my mood. I would have told anybody summer was my fourth favorite season, even before heat waves like this happened. So just feel sullen and miserable in these last few days, besides having a perpetual headache and just hoping the weather's better where you are and wondering whether you have similar feelings when it's miserable near you.
Well, I think sullen and miserable might be a pretty good description of people who live in Seattle during the months from November up through March. So it's kind of a, choose your poison. We have had a very manic depressive summer this year in Seattle. Today it was cloudy and cold this morning, so much so that I had to wear a coat. And yesterday afternoon, it was so hot that I had to get out of the apartment and find shade underneath a tree. So it's really fluctuating broadly. And I hear that temperatures will get into the 90s next week. So I will eventually feel your pain, but currently I do not.
Yeah, well, I would long for a cold morning right now. I'm a homebody and I like staying in and I like air conditioning, but it's, when you feel like you can't go outside without dripping with sweat and ruining your whole day. But I guess that's the reality we're all facing in the era of climate change, right?
Yeah. There's a local weather guy at University of Washington meteorology professor who has a blog. And he's gotten kind of a reputation locally for posting a series of blog posts that say, A, climate change is real, and B, what you're experiencing today is not a sign of climate change, where he's kind of playing both sides there. And he, again, posted one of those things this morning. So maybe this is climate change and maybe it's just a really hot day.
Yeah. Okay, well, why don't we move on to a much happier topic? The intersection of abortion and crime.
Nothing happier than that.
Yeah. This is a topic that I kind of had in my back pocket for a while, a theory that attempts to intersect abortion and crime that I heard about a long time ago, kind of had in the back of my mind, and honestly on my running list of topics to ask you about someday. And then it just seems like the times dictate the question, The Supreme Court reverses Roe v. Wade, and crime is on the rise for reasons that we don't seem to have a precise fix on. And so it just seemed the time was right to ask this question about a hypothesis derived by two academic economists postulating that the legalization of abortion in the 1970s is somehow tied to the decrease in crime rates that began in the 1990s. So I asked you about it. I was hoping you could tell me more about the hypothesis itself, fill in the meat on the bones I just presented, and also your opinion about whether it holds water, whether it makes sense. So what did you find?
Well, thank you as always for the question. And I have to say this is not an easy one to answer. There are lots of competing arguments circulating around this issue, all of which draw on complicated data sets and involve long and complicated mathematical equations and expert-level statistical methods. I studied the humanities, Joe. I'm simply not equipped to get down into the weeds of such a technical argument. I can, however, sketch the lay of the land and draw a few conclusions that seem to be reasonable, and so that's what I plan to do.
Okay, go for it.
When you ask about the Donohue-Levitt hypothesis, you're referring to an argument that was first published in 2001 by Stephen Levitt of the University of Chicago and John Donohue of Yale University, which sought to explain why the national crime rate in America had begun to decline year over year starting in the early 1990s. This decline in the crime rate is, by the way, something we referenced in episode 40 of Mansplaining, the skinny on crime statistics. So that's a good one to check back with.
Yes.
In their paper, Donohue and Levitt noted that the peak crime committing age is 18 to 24 years old, which, by the way, also happens to overlap with the period in our lives when we got to know each other in a University of Chicago dormitory. I don't remember us committing a lot of crime at the time, but then that was also the period in my life when I first came into contact with hard alcohol, so I might have forgotten a few things.
Yeah, there was that crime. Yeah, but that's an acceptable crime when you're in college.
Or at least an expected one.
Yes.
So if criminals enter their prime around the age of 18, that means a baby who was born in 1973 would reach peak crime committing age in 1991, which is right about the time when national crime rates started to decline. And one of the singular events of 1973 was Roe v. Wade, the Supreme Court decision that, until just recently, protected a woman's right to an abortion and overturned numerous state laws that outlawed or put severe restrictions on the practice. Donohue and Levitt provide a lot of stats and tables in support of the argument that the legalization of abortion was responsible for, by their estimate, 49% of the decline in the overall crime rate and 80% of the decline in the murder rate between 1991 and 1997, which was the endpoint of their data in that 2001 paper. While some people have since accused them of advancing a implicitly racist argument that legalized abortion reduced crime by calling the population of those classes and ethnicities that are widely assumed to be more prone to criminal activity, their actual argument was more nuanced than that. Donohue and Levitt argued that fetuses aborted after 1973, if brought to term, would have been more likely to have experienced a difficult childhood, since they'd have been raised by mothers who didn't want them and who might not have been in a position to support them economically or emotionally.
Right.
Abortion, in other words, had the secondary effect of boosting the percentage of babies who were welcomed by their parents and raised in circumstances that are more likely to produce law-abiding citizens, which, Donohue and Levitt argue, served to reduce crime. They were not the first to make this argument. There was a study in Sweden nearly 35 years earlier, in 1966, that reached similar conclusions. That study tracked 188 women who were denied an abortion at a hospital in Göteborg, Sweden, and compared their unwanted children to the very next child born at the same hospital. The unwanted children were more likely than the control group to grow up in single-parent households or in foster homes, and were more likely to become delinquents and engage in crime. That, to my eyes, seems like an undersized data set, only 188 participants. So while interesting, you could argue that the study's results are questionable. But I don't know about you, but when I first read about this hypothesis, it made a certain amount of intuitive sense. Would you agree?
Oh, yes, I do agree. I'm almost afraid to admit that. The fact that the drop in crime started only after the post-Roe cohort of children came of age, that seems compelling just on its face.
Yes.
You know?
Yeah.
Now, I'm sure it's much more complicated than that, and there are a lot of other potential reasons, but that alone in isolation is compelling.
Yes, agreed. In isolation, it seems like cut and dried. And then later in this episode, we will come across some of the complications that other people have raised. So,
okay,
good preview of where we're headed. Like you, when I first came across the argument, I found it to be intriguing. But even so, it might have remained almost entirely obscure if it had only been published and discussed in scholarly journals. In 2005, though, Levitt co-authored a best-selling book called Freakonomics, and the abortion and crime thesis was the subject of one of its chapters, and this gave the idea a much wider currency. So there are too many scholarly takes on this topic to mention here, but I'll take us through an incomplete sample. In 2001, John Law and John Whitley argued that there was an incorrect assumption in the Donohue-Levitt hypothesis, namely that states which completely legalized abortion must have had higher abortion rates than states that restricted abortion to certain situations, and that CDC statistics do not substantiate this claim. Records indicate that prior to Roe v. Wade, large numbers of women traveled to get the abortion services they needed. Let's take an example. New York State legalized abortion in 1970, 3 years prior to Roe v. Wade, and women from across the country traveled there for an abortion. Joe, can you guess the number of women who traveled to New York from the state of Michigan for an abortion in the period 1971 to 1972? And I can't imagine why you would be able to guess that, but I'm curious what the number in your head might be.
Yeah, I suspect my answer is going to be off by a magnitude of 10, probably, one way or the other. But I'm going to say I'm going to say a lot. I'm going to say, 5,000.
5,000 would be a lot. It is way less than the actual number. The actual number is 29,227.
Wow.
So nearly 30,000 women, and that was just from one state, and only traveling to one of the 3 states that had legalized abortion at that point, because California and Colorado had already legalized abortion back in 1967. So legalization wasn't a singular event that happened in 1973.
Wow.
It was more a gradual accumulation of reproductive rights.
Can I also, I don't know if you're planning to talk about this, but I'm also curious about the kind of women from Michigan and elsewhere who would have come to New York. Now that Roe has been overturned, the big talk among the pro-choice contingent is that now abortion becomes this choice that can only be made by well-off women who can afford to go to a different state. And I'm guessing that was probably the case pre-Roe v. Wade, and that those Michigan women who traveled in 1971 were probably relatively better off than the average woman at that time. Do you know anything about that?
I do. Not in any detail, because, of course, the record keeping wasn't necessarily good then. But
Right.
by one estimate, there were nearly 600,000 abortions in the U.S. in 1972, the year before Roe v. Wade. And the figure for the following year, which Levitt and Donohue take as the starting point for their hypothesis, was only 27% higher. And I did find one study that talked about the women who were able to travel. And like you say, it was easier for women who were middle class or upper class than poor women. It also would have been easier for white women than for women of color. But also another limit, of course, was the distance that you had to travel. The further New York is from where you're living, the less likely you're able to get to New York. So there were definitely limitations on these women, but there were also 600,000 women the year prior to Roe v. Wade. So without knowing for sure, we can presume that it was not strictly upper-class women who were able to do this. So Lott and Whitley do make a good point. Levitt and Donohue appear to assume that Roe v. Wade greatly increased the number of abortions in most U.S. states starting in 1973, but the effect was most likely not as great as they suggest. Also, Lott and Whitley point out if abortion is causing crime rates to fall, then the first age group to show a decline in crime rates should be younger offenders. But their study of murder rates within age groups shows that the rate declined first among the oldest age groups. The youngest age group is the last to show a similar decline. Lott and Whitley go so far as to argue that legalization of abortion somehow caused murders to increase by 7%, though they notably do not offer any real explanation for why this would be the case, aside from some vague hand-waving about the undesirability of babies being born out of wedlock.
That doesn't make any sense to me, but...
Well, this is also a study that favorably quoted a George Will opinion piece in Newsweek magazine that legalized abortion causes a coarsening of society. So I don't think it's entirely offbeat to think that there was a little bit of ideology behind their study.
Okay.
But
Got it. Yep.
in 2004, Ted Joyce pointed out a potentially serious flaw in Donohue and Levitt's reasoning. The early 1990s wasn't only when babies born just after Roe v. Wade reached their late teens, it was also the end of the crack epidemic that raged throughout the 1980s and almost certainly boosted crime rates during that period. Almost certainly some of the decline in crime, and possibly a lot of it, was at least initially driven by this change. And then in 2005, 2 scholars, Christopher Foote and Christopher Getz, asserted that they had found a computer error in Levitt and Donohue's statistical analysis that inflated their results. When you correct for that error using the same data set, the correlation between legalized abortion and crime is cut in half. They also criticized Levitt and Donohue for relying on arrest totals rather than arrests per capita, since only the latter accounts for population size and its fluctuations over time. Their paper argues that rerunning the analysis with arrest rates rather than arrest totals eliminates the abortion effect entirely. Then in 2007, Jessica Reyes published a paper arguing that the phase-out of lead from gasoline, a consequence of the Clean Air Act in 1970, was responsible for 56% of the decline in crime between 1992 and 2002, since exposure to lead in children has been shown to be associated with aggressive and criminal behavior later in life. Reyes actually accepted Donohue and Levitt's argument that abortion reduced crime rates, but she argued that it was a lesser contributing factor to the overall reduction. Other scholars pointed out that abortion rates peaked in 1980, when there were 29 abortions per 1,000 women, but went into a steady decline in the following years. If Levitt and Donohue were right, you might expect a rise in crime rates beginning in 1998, but actually they continued to fall for another couple decades. Levitt and Donohue argue that this presumably voluntary reduction in abortion rates indicates a decline in unwanted pregnancies, which would be consistent with their thesis, but in the absence of proof, that's at best a supposition, and this claim has been met with skepticism in the scholarly community.
Right.
Meanwhile, over in Europe, studies in 2007 and 2014 showed no correlation between abortion access and reduction in crime rates, while a third study in 2014 argued that legalized abortion caused a significant decrease in crime. So whether it's here in the U.S. or across the Atlantic, different scholars and different studies are reaching different results.
Yes, and I did know about some of those other factors. You mentioned lead gasoline. I had also heard that the phase out in lead paint may also have been a contributing factor.
Yes, absolutely.
A lot of kids, especially in impoverished backgrounds, were ingesting lead paint chips on the floors of their apartments. And then also something we went into great detail about in our crime statistics episode that you already cited, the large increases in policing in the 1990s and the large increases in incarceration in the 1990s.
Right.
And that's, taking the potential wrongdoers off the streets in such large numbers that crime would have to go down. So
yeah,
I do think there are a lot of other factors that pass the so-called smell test. They seem plausible on their face.
Right. Yeah, agreed. Levitt responded to these counter-arguments twice, in 2005 and 2020. And both times he reiterated the original conclusions and only revised the argument in superficial ways. So in academic circles, at least, the disagreement appears to be leading nowhere. They're just going around in circles, and there appears to be a fair amount of name-calling going on in the meantime. So what can we conclude from all of this? First, while it does feel like the Levitt-Donohue hypothesis makes a certain amount of intuitive sense, even now, we also have to allow for the fact that there are a number of studies arguing that the connection between abortion access and crime reduction is either substantially less than in the Donohue-Levitt hypothesis, or that it doesn't exist at all. As I said at the top of this episode, I don't have the mathematical skills to get into the weeds of this argument. Maybe one of our listeners would be able to dive in and determine which arguments draw on the best data sets and make the best use of statistical methods, but that sort of thing is outside of my skill set. Simply the fact, though, that highly trained scholars can look at the same question, use the same methods, draw on the same data, and arrive at completely opposite results is a pretty good sign that we may never have a final answer to this question. In 2008, Foote and Getz returned to the debate with an update to their paper that, among other things, illustrates that the state-level data is so messy and incomplete that it's essentially impossible to prove or disprove the Levitt-Donohue hypothesis. Questions like this depend on the quality of the data, and with 50 states applying possibly 50 different methodologies to the data they gather and report, anyone attempting to draw conclusions from that data needs to patch over the inconsistencies and omissions, and in the process, choose to include some of the data while ignoring or attempting to repair other parts. There's an old computer programmer saying, garbage in, garbage out. Your statistical methods may be impeccable, but if the data you feed into the algorithm is questionable, your results will be no better. This fact is why we have that famous old quote from Benjamin Disraeli. There are three kinds of lies: lies, damned lies, and statistics. As a general principle, when experts disagree, we should be careful not to give extra weight to the argument that happens to be included in a New York Times bestseller. Levitt has a bigger platform than his critics, but that doesn't mean that his arguments are necessarily better. And another general principle, as we've touched on in this podcast before, beware of simple explanations for complex phenomena. Donohue and Levitt might well be correct that abortion access had an effect on crime rates, but that this one factor was responsible for nearly half of an ongoing multi-decade reduction in crime, I would say that's probably overstating the case. A truer statement is probably that abortion access was one contributing factor, along with changes in drug use and addiction, the prevalence of lead in our environment, policing and sentencing guidelines, urban density, income inequality, and so on. And as we've already mentioned, the data is so messy, inconsistent, and incomplete that we'll probably never have a definitive answer on which factor or factors had the greatest effect. We do, however, have an upcoming test of the Donohue-Levitt hypothesis. Assuming that the decision overturning Roe v. Wade is not itself overturned by act of Congress or future Supreme Court decision, in 18 years or so there should be a big burst in crime in the U.S., or maybe there won't be. If mansplaining is still chugging along in 2040, I make this promise to our listeners. We'll record an episode that tries to answer the question once and for all.
Yeah, that occurred to me too. I actually was jotting down notes while you were speaking that if crime goes up in 18 years, that'll be further evidence that Levitt and Donohue were onto something. So I think that's a good point you make. I want to mention something about one of your last points first, but I have a few thoughts about this. One is on the beware of the simplistic theory to explain everything. I get where you're coming from there, but I just want to say something in defense of that kind of approach, that I think a lot of academics, the ones who really make it into the cultural zeitgeist, do so because they're attempting to explain in layman's terms things that are very esoteric and hard to explain. And I kind of think that the genius of the Levitt-Donohue approach here is that they've got the knack of being able to explain it to the layman. And that's hard to do,
Sure.
So I don't think we should just dismiss out of hand what we might call the popularization of academic theories, because if you're clever enough to write it in a way that gains cultural footing, then that's significant.
Yeah. Let me say I agree with you in principle, but I'm not sure it applies to this particular situation. In principle, we are totally on the same page. My mentor at the University of Chicago was a popularizer within the subject of the history of religions. She received some criticism from her more ivory tower rivals who thought that was sort of debasing the dialogue in order to popularize it. I totally disagree with that. I think that academia, when it only talks to itself, is not advancing a social good. And I really think that popularizers are important. That being said, I would point out that Donohue and Levitt first introduced this hypothesis not in Freakonomics, but in a scholarly journal. And that they have been quite pugnacious in insisting that no, everyone is wrong. It was just this one cause of that 49% effect.
Yeah.
And so it's not, in this case, it's not a matter of them, for lack of a better term, dumbing it down and for people like us to understand it. Though that certainly did boost sales in books like Freakonomics. It's a good sales category. In this case, they are just using a sledgehammer to insist that one factor had an enormous effect when everyone else seems to be raising their hand to say, well, there was a lot of other stuff going on at the same time. And I just feel in my gut that there's a lot of other stuff going on. It probably doesn't sell books, but it's also probably a better description of reality.
Right. Yeah, well, I certainly agree. It's a point against them if their argument is that their answer alone explains this phenomenon and doesn't admit to the possibility of there being other explanations, that this is that the phenomenon is a pie, and a piece of the pie belongs to legalized abortion and another piece belongs to other explanations. So I think I do agree with your overall take that this is probably more of a both and situation than an either or, that all these things we mentioned in this episode are probably responsible for a portion of the decline in crime. And it's a bit presumptuous and egotistical to keep arguing pugnaciously, as you say, that your solution alone is the answer and everybody else is off the mark.
Yeah, particularly when your solution might have different effects in different places. Like maybe the Donohue-Levitt hypothesis holds really strongly in South Carolina, but less so in California.
Right.
And that's probably a pretty good description of the reality, but because of the way they present the argument, it's just like, this is the thing. This is the effect, and in 18 years, they'll be proven right.
Yeah.
And, they might be. I would not be shocked and dismayed. Well, I would be dismayed if crime goes up in 18 years. But I would not be completely overwhelmed with disbelief if that in fact plays out.
Yes.
Because I do find the thesis to have some intuitive sense. But I think my money is more on the mixed effect.
Right. And I think you mentioned one of the researchers who came up after them. I think you mentioned Reyes, acknowledged that Donohue and Levitt could be onto something, but said that there's this other thing. There's this leaded gasoline reduction that's also, that's kind of academic humility, you know, and I appreciate that. Right. And that researcher's probably closer to the truth.
Yeah. I salute the researchers who advance theses that are less likely to get them book contracts, but are more likely to be a description of reality.
Yeah. But there is one other topic I want to discuss, and it's about the concept of unwanted children. You know, this is the part of the Donohue-Levitt thesis that resonates the most with me. And I'm thinking of, you know, the classic study of the chimpanzees where the mother was taken away from the infant chimpanzee almost at birth, and within 3 days the infant chimpanzee had withered and died, you know, even after being supplied with food and shelter. You know, they just withered and died because they didn't get that critical interaction with their mother that they needed. And I do think that this is a important part of primate behavior, that if indeed Roe v. Wade signaled a reduction in unprepared, ill-equipped parents, teenagers, the poor, unmarried people, young people, then I think it's highly likely that the fact that there were fewer unwanted children does connect to crime, because crime is the kind of pathology that develops when you were parented badly. You know, nobody is born a criminal. You are raised a criminal, not born a criminal.
Yeah, I totally agree.
So that part of the thesis resonates with me, and I just wonder what you think about that.
Yeah, just emotionally, intuitively, and also like you in terms of what I've read, I feel a loving household is critical to the development of the person who comes out of that household, and that all sorts of pathologies in our society can be traced back to parents who were unwilling or unable to dispense the sort of love that their kids needed. So, yeah, totally agree. And if, in fact, abortion access has a controlling effect on the number of unwanted births and unwilling or unable to be loving mothers, then, yeah, that would be deleterious to society if that goes up.
Yeah.
So I know that I mostly just muddied the waters today, but did this feel like a good answer to your question?
Yes, I think so. I think you're a little bit more suspicious of the motives of this research than I am, but I think you landed in the right spot. And after hearing the pro and con, I'm kind of with you that nobody's got a monopoly on the truth. There are a lot of smart people doing research on this subject, and everybody's ideas are valuable and worthwhile and shouldn't be dismissed out of hand. So I do think it's probably a combination of factors, but I'm not willing to write off legalized abortion as one of those factors, and perhaps a significant factor in the decrease in crime.
No, neither am I. The study that I mentioned towards the end, in Foot and Getz returning to the issue in 2008 with an update, I feel like they made the singular most important contribution to it by just pointing out the fact that with a data set as messy as this one, you cannot prove or disprove the argument. So even though they raised objections to Donohue and Levitt, they make the point that they are not disproving it. They're just pointing out difficulties with the proof and uncertainties going out of the data. And so you can kind of take that in whichever direction your gut tells you to go. That the fact that the data does not allow you to prove it, you could say, okay, well, then I'm going to assume that that effect doesn't exist. Or you can take it in the other way and say that the data does not disprove it. That means the intuitive sense that this idea makes, that's actually compelling for me.
Yeah, agreed. And as you said earlier, in 18 to 24 years, we'll have more data
Right.
to think about.
So tune back into mansplaining.
Yes. Let's just hope I live that long.
Yeah.
But until then, we will continue this podcast. And accordingly, I'm going to wait for your question for next time now.
Okay. Back in college, I took a class in which we read Homer's Iliad. And there's a memorable line in which the hero Achilles says of his bitter rival Agamemnon, who had just snatched away Achilles' female companion, quote, "Are the sons of Atreus the only ones who love their wives?" I remember our professor warning us. Romantic love, she said, was a notion that was first created in Europe during the Middle Ages. So whatever Achilles was talking about, it could not have been love as we understand it today. Since then, I've been wondering about this. Not every day, mind you, but from time to time. Was romantic love truly created in the Middle Ages? If so, does that mean that other cultures in the world, who draw less heavily than we do on European culture and history, may have a completely different idea of what love is? Has pop music been lying to us this whole time? So I put it to you, Joe, in the words of Cole Porter, what is this thing called love? Oh. Is the love we feel for our wives and our dogs an accident of history and culture? Or was my professor wrong because love is, in fact, a basic human emotion, and we can be confident that 3,000 years ago and outside the walls of Troy, Achilles might, in fact, have been in love with his wife?
Wow. You go for the big-time questions, don't you, Mark?
Yeah. I wish I'd thought of asking this one right around Valentine's Day, but it only just came to me.
Yeah. Well, it may take me until Valentine's Day to answer it, so we still have a chance here.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's, I guess I'll need to be careful not to plagiarize Cole Porter in my answer. I'll have to paraphrase. But yeah, interesting question. I'll get on that and let you know what I think.
Okay, I look forward to hearing what you come back with.
Okay, well, you guys know what's going to come now. This is the end of our episode, and we'll be back in a couple weeks with a new episode of Mansplaining. But if you have any thoughts about this episode or the podcast in general, we urge you to go to our Facebook page, Mansplaining the Podcast, and leave your thoughts there in the comments section. You can also like us. You can check our sources. You can leave a comment or a question about what you just heard, and you can also suggest topics for future episodes. We appreciate all that feedback. We'd also love it if you give us a rating, write a review on whatever app you use to listen to this podcast. So please do that if you haven't already. And to those of you listeners who haven't yet responded in this way, we've asked nicely.
So many times.
But so far you haven't responded.
So many times that we've gone out and we put our heart on the line. And in a preview of next week's episode, we're holding the boombox outside your window, playing the Peter Gabriel song, saying, can you please just show us a little bit of love?
Right. And don't get me wrong, folks. I'm okay with your silence. Mark is pissed, though. He wants to wring your neck.
One by one.
So you better answer. But that's all for this episode of Mansplaining. That was a very pissed off Mark. And I'm Joe. And we'll talk to you next time.
See you then. That's it for this edition of Mansplaining. Mansplaining is brought to you by Joe and Mark and nobody else. Thank you for hanging out with us for a little bit, and we'll see you next time.